sign off. But thank you very much for doing this with her. Her thesis is wonderful, and I'm very excited to see what the final version is going to be.
Awesome. Thank you, professors. Thank
All
you
right.
for the support.
Okay, Abby, the floor is officially yours, and have a great interview.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Oof, sorry about that. I was having
Okay. Technology does what it does. I just wanted to make sure I was in the right space at the right time. So I'm glad it worked out and that your professor was able to support you.
yeah, thank you so much.
Mhm.
Wow, I'm so excited.
Mhm.
So I'm currently recording this interview, if that's all right with you.
Yes, sure.
So before we begin, I just kind of wanted to give the Zoom meeting itself kind of like an introduction of who you are. And
Sure.
so I have a little intro that I'd like to read off of. So
Sure.
Shannon, sorry. Shawnee
Okay.
Mae Benton, an influential advocate, speaker, a strong force of nature dedicated to speaking up about social justice issues, mental health, and maternal well-being for all. She is a transformative leader whose work lies at the critical intersection of racialized narratives, systemic inequalities, and community healing. As a co-founder of and co-CE, well, as a co-founder and CEO of Spirit and Women Leadership Development Institute and co-founder of the Raya Foundation, Ms. Benton has worked extensively in advocating for reproductive justice, racial inequity, um, trauma and healing therapy. In her work, she merges both activism and holistic wellness practices that empower, inspire, and dismantle systemic inequalities for women of color. Her work centers around intersectional impacts on mental health, trauma, and ancestral healing, making her a powerful voice in the fight for birthing, equity, and holistic well being. Her work challenges deeply embedded assumptions in medicine, public health care, reframing the narrative around birth, trauma, and holistic well being through an intersectional and healing approach. She addresses deeply embedded biases, reframing narratives around birth, trauma, and healing while empowering women of color. With her background in social work, healing arts, and community organizing, she offers invaluable insights into how the stories we tell and the language we use can either uphold or dismantle systemic barriers to inequitable care. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to engage in this conversation with you as part of my research on how racialized narratives shape societal attitudes, reinforcing biases, and contribute to healthcare inequities. Her expertise serves as a powerful catalyst for systemic change. So thank you for joining in this meeting with me. I'm gonna kind of read off set questions that I shared with you and yeah. So can you share a bit about your journey and what led you to focus on reproductive justice and maternal health advocacy?
Sure. So there are many intersecting answers around this question. Um, First and foremost, my lived experience. I come from a family where the women on my mother's side were giving birth and having challenges, whether it was preterm labor or struggles during the pregnancy journey itself, or postpartum challenges with postpartum depression, psychoses, um, pregnancy loss, just all of the different levels of trauma that one can experience while trying to bring new life into the world. And so that lived experience, watching my mother's struggles, but not knowing why she was struggling. She had 5 children, and some of the things that were being said about her, and just also watching some of the other women and their partners trying to navigate through these traumas. And once again, I was young and didn't understand context or have the language that I have now, but I knew something was terribly wrong. And I'm like, why our family? And what's the meaning of this? The other piece for me is as I started to pursue higher education and also started to read about um, just different groups, especially Black and Brown people, and our experiences here in the United States and abroad. And then once I left the world of academics as a student and started to pursue employment, and I, was able to manifest jobs in social services. I was a case manager. I was a substance abuse specialist and like just different work that I did with different communities and different contexts, I started to discover that there was a theme throughout those spaces that Black and Brown families were disproportionately impacted by homelessness. That's the language we used at the time. So they were unhoused more than their white counterparts, that there were issues with mental health and substance abuse, and just challenges with the child welfare system. And I didn't just work here in New York because I live in New York, and I've lived here for 51 of my 56 years on the planet. But when I did work in North Carolina, and I also worked in Georgia when I lived in Savannah, it was the same situation. And I'm like, are we inherently flawed as a people? Do we not know how to raise our children? Do we not know how to live life on life's terms? I didn't believe that at the core. Throughout the course of my life, I met amazing people doing phenomenal things, families that were just really, really powerful and cohesive and connected. And so I was like, there's something else going on here. And so it just gave me the impetus to do a deeper search and study and to want to design programs and to create safe spaces and havens for folks to heal, transform, tell their stories in a different way than the narratives that I was seeing inside of these systems that I was working in. And so, just I saw myself in the folks that I was serving. I saw my family in the folks that I was serving and wanted to do something that was more generative, transformative, and healing for communities of color. Then finally, my lived experience on a different level, being pregnant more than 3 times, but having 3 children, live births, and we can talk more extensively about what I mean by that. But my experiences of being pregnant and then also having my children, and with all 3 of them, because of the family history, I experienced postpartum depression in different ways because it doesn't always look the same for people. And that's another misconception. And I just realized that inside of the experience of being pregnant, birthing, and then postpartum, that I experienced obstetric violence, disrespect and disregard, not being listened to because of the color of my skin, because of me being young. When I had my first 2 children, a young married woman, a former military wife, just all of those parts played a role in my experience of trauma, and then also my desire to make sure that others didn't experience these things when they were involved with the most sacred time, which is pregnancy and bringing new life into the world. I view them as rites of passage. And the final thing that I will say is that I've been an artist since I was a kid. A deep love for music, singing, dancing. I've always been a writer, a poet. I've always had this ferocious appetite for reading and just drama, whether it was television drama or on stage drama in theater, being a thespian from a very young age. I just had this passion for telling stories and also different ways of telling stories. And I was also, because I'm 56, I grew up in a world where a lot of folks on television or on stage did not look like me. And that was disturbing to me. Not from the beginning, though. I thought I had this experience retrospectively, just recognizing that I thought whiteness and the white aesthetic, there was like a beauty bias for me unconsciously until it became conscious, that those who are the most powerful, those who are the most beautiful, those who are the most aligned with how to live well were people who did not look like me, were white people. And so it took a minute for me to get clear about the fact that my people are beautiful and that some of the paradigms that existed in the world were very aligned with white supremacy culture and inequities and bias and colorism and all the things that make it hard for a Black or brown person to navigate the world with ease and healthfully. So that's the story of how I landed in this space.
Yeah, that sounds beautiful. Like just taking a moment to step back and just analyzing all of your experiences. You're very like strong and powerful.
Thank you.
To moving on to the next question. In your experience, how do racialized narratives, both historical and contemporary, shape public perceptions and of Black and Indigenous maternal health. You kind of touched upon this with like the implicit biases that are present in society, and this is also what my research kind of touches upon, but I wanted to get your perspective on this as well.
Sure. So there's a concept there are several, but there's one concept in particular that supports me in just thinking about and answering this question about racialized narratives and just this historical and contemporary framework that shapes how we're viewed as a people, how maternal health, pregnancy, and birthing, and all of that is managed in the world by the dominant culture, folks who identify as white, folks who identify as male, folks who have privilege, who are educated. And I do air quotes with educated because education comes in many forms. So these racialized narratives have always served as like tools for control and erasure of the Black and Brown experience, Indigenous experience, Indigenous and Black and Brown worldviews, which we're not a monolith, but there's like these common themes amongst us that I'm very, very proud of and deeply moved by. So historically, Black and Brown and Indigenous people of color have been dehumanized. And when it comes to the medical field, there has been this heavy-handedness around making sure that our experiences are controlled by those who don't look like us, that our stories are told from their perspective, and we're looked at through the gaze of whiteness. And as a result, we're viewed as less than. There's this horrible belief that was so-called based on study and empirical data and research that we don't feel pain as Black people, like our white counterparts, and that we're not worthy of having a voice or being autonomous. There's just been this mindset of either intentionally or unconsciously rendering us invisible in systems of care that are supposed to listen deeply to the person on the other side of the medical engagement and partnership, because that's ultimately what it's supposed to be. How do you know my body better than I do? How do you lump me together? And once again, we're not a monolith. We're not all this single body. We're all very, very different. There are some commonalities, but to operate from a space of best because of something that you read in a textbook or your limited interactions with people who might look the same or live in the same community. I just think that it has done great damage, and that story has perpetuated itself. And I didn't name the concept. So it's Sankofa. So Sankofa is the way out is back through, or go back and fetch it. It's like a bird, and the bird is looking over its shoulder, back in the other direction towards the past. And it has this small egg in its beak, which is very delicate. The past is delicate. How we approach the past and apply it in the present moment is delicate. And then how we utilize those two energies, past and present, to manifest the future, that's a delicate balance as well. So when stories are told that we don't deserve as much, whether it's conscious or unconscious, the belief is that if we don't speak English, or if we, practice a different faith, or if we, operate in our families differently, if we eat different foods, if our bodies look differently than what the dominant culture expects, if we have more flesh on our bones than what is expected, that we don't have a handle on our health and well-being, and we don't have a say as it relates to what needs to happen next for ourselves, whether it's taking medication, or amplifying the birthing experience by giving Pitocin or some other medication that will move the birthing process forward and faster. Whether we have a choice about whether we get a C-section or not, like all of that, those narratives dictate what happens in birthing spaces for Black and Brown folk. And the public perception is still shaped by tropes about the strong Black woman, how we're unfit mothers. And it just denies us the complexity of life and living, and the need for care, the need for respect, the right to be believed. And these stories and narratives create systemic neglect and are embedded in every level of the maternal health crisis that we're navigating now. And we definitely need to address them and deal with these biases and bring them to the forefront as clinicians, because I'm a clinician too, and providers of care, so that we can do better and do no harm.
Mhm. Yeah, just to like kind of reiterate or like touch more upon that is that my research also kind of like follows in through that this isn't race is not a biological reality. It's more of a human invention, if so to say, because of how race has become a social construct that has really embedded itself in the many systems that we have and have truly created many inequalities that so many communities are facing harm from. So, yeah, kind of to elaborate more. So, race-based medicine isn't just a relic of the past, it's still present in today's time. And I think that having more research and more advocates speaking up about it is crucial in order to have some type of change. I feel like it's so important to have these conversations about what the power of language and what racialized narratives really do within our current society. So, to continue with the questions, what role does language play in reinforcing biases within healthcare and public spaces? Can you share some examples of where framing or certain terms or some of the medias contribute to these inequalities?
Yes. I say this often. I might have said it in the documentary Aftershock that my family is in, that's about the Black maternal health crisis in the United States. But I'm a word person, and words create worlds. So do wombs. And when there's a blend of mindset and language that says my womb or the wombs of Black and Brown women and birthing people are inherently flawed, that they're broken and what we produce is broken, then we have a huge problem. And words create context. Language is not neutral. Depending on who's speaking the language, the power that they wield and the privilege that they wield will determine who has and who has not, and who is deserving of support, respect, as I was saying earlier, a level of autonomy, agency as it relates to their own bodies. When we talk about reproductive health and reproductive justice, bodily autonomy is a huge part of that. But if you don't understand that concept and you have words in you from what you've read and what you've talked about with other people who also are privileged like you, what you've misinterpreted because you don't have the context to understand and understand what is being said, it can do great damage, which the ultimate fatal outcome is death and destruction. And then also, we don't talk about as much because people concentrate on the deaths that have happened with Black and Brown folks in the birthing space, but there are more impacts around morbidity, near-death experiences, which come from the misinterpretation of the language of the people. And that doesn't always mean they speak another language. That means they may speak and process information and life and living differently than you because of culture and their lived experience. So, yeah, words carry history, they carry power, and they carry deep consequences, especially for the folks who don't have the power to declare what words mean, like the written material, the media coverage, the things that are written online in like the literal papers or magazines about the experiences. So when we refer to Black and Brown and Indigenous mothers and birthing people, when they come into the hospital space or a clinic space and they're pushing back and asking questions, when we write notes in a chart that say they are non-compliant or resistant or challenging, we're setting the stage for anybody who reads that material after you've written it as a doctor or a nurse or medical provider to embrace that as the truth and the single narrative that you need to operate from. So how I treat you after I read non-compliant or resistant in your chart may be very low vibrational and may turn down the volume on my listening of you when you're talking about what you're experiencing in your pregnancy or in your postpartum journey or when you're birthing, like what you need. There have been so many circumstances where I've spoken to people, because I've been in this work for years, where they've been telling the doctors or the providers, I still feel pain after the epidural that has been given. It's like, that's that's impossible. No, you're not feeling pain. And then lo and behold, we discover that the medication is not being dispensed, or whatever the circumstance was, that there was absolutely pain still present. But of course, you don't know better with your own body. I know better because I'm the doctor. I am the anesthesiologist. I know what's happening with you better than you do. So rather than exploring systemic barriers that the persons that you're serving, are facing in their day to day, we shift blame onto the individual. It's like they're flawed, they're out of order, and so therefore they need to be checked and talked about in ways that dehumanize. So when risk and trauma is made diminished into a space of this false narrative about the body being flawed or something being wrong with you. When the media writes this tragic and rare issue that is occurring, rather than looking at the systemic patterns, the institutional racism that exists, the individual racism and biases that exist, then we perpetuate the same crisis, and then we end up having folks have near-death experiences or loss of life. So language can either liberate or limit us. And so we must be intentional about the words that we use and how we listen to the words that are coming out of other folks who may have a different lived experience and way of expressing themselves than us. So we have to make sure that we're doing the extra work so that we don't do damage in our listening.
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel like that's why education is such a pivotal force in which I can actually tackle this. I feel like cultural competency is something that needs to be number one priority in medical schools. I think is my opinion. I feel like with the ways that I have been taught as a New York City student, like I've born and raised, grown up here, we learned about like the master narrative, or
Yes.
we would call the dominant narrative. So the master narrative kind of touches upon this and how we should learn how to diverge from the master narrative and take in different perspectives, because that is what's truly gonna cause more of a revolution.
Sure.
So with these dominant narratives that are in medicine influencing these patient-provider interactions, particularly in the context of maternal health. You kind of touched upon this before, but like, where do you see how these dominant narratives truly cause harm? So you kind of talked about this more sort of in a sense of not being heard, but do you want to talk more about that?
Sure, sure. I want to share a quote by Audre Lorde. She says, or said, because she's now an ancestor, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Like, using these dominant narratives, using these paradigms, these structures, the context that white supremacy and patriarchy has set forth, colonization will not shift the dynamics that we're dealing with now in these systems, and that are causing harm in our day to day. So when I think about dominant narratives in medicine, what they often assume is that medical knowledge is objective when it's not. There's the science, and there are things that are black and white, and it's, 1 + 1 = 2, but that's not always the case. And also, medical knowledge is incomplete, in a lot of instances. And so to operate like this is it, and this static mindset about it is dangerous. But the dominant narrative is shaped by, who historically has held the power to define what health is and what it means, what disease, or what I say dis-ease means, and what healing means. I'm a person that believes in indigenous practice and culture. I'm very eclectic in my approach to navigating. I've been trained as a psychotherapist, but I integrate many, many different worldviews into the work that I do as a healer and psychotherapist, and as a leader. And so doing that has helped me to grow and also meet folks where they truly are, and not just based on what I've learned in school. In fact, a lot of what I've learned hasn't necessarily been useful in Black and Brown communities. So these dominant narratives that have infiltrated and created toxicity in spaces. Not all, because I don't want to lump everything together. There's absolutely workability around the use of medical knowledge, and we've done amazing things in this country and abroad using this science and the knowledge that exists. But there's a lot missing and a lot left to be desired. So when a provider unconsciously believes that, a Black birthing person is exaggerating pain, as I mentioned earlier, or less educated about their bodies, when the provider is using the narrative and the language and jargon of his training or her training and development, and not thinking about bringing the language not down, but across to the person that's on the receiving end so they can understand it, digest it, and apply it, or at least know what their options are and make a powerful decision, it's problematic. So how questions are asked, how concerns are received, how decisions are made in the day-to-day in these spaces, clinics, and hospitals across the nation and abroad, that determines how a person's quality of life can be manifested or not. Like, you can be severely damaged or killed by choices that are made from the dominant narrative. So trust breaks down when patients sense that their full humanity isn't being honored, and that it's you talking down to me because you know best. The white coat syndrome, which I've experienced also in my lifetime. These narratives and belief systems are why so many of us walk into hospitals as Black and brown people feeling guarded, fearful, silent, and wondering if we're going to make it out of there alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of touching upon what you said, and also talking more about my research too. I use the historical kind of framework in a sense of like, I view the exploitation that many Black women faced during the early kind of invention or creation of the field of gynecology. So this is also talked about in the film of Aftershock with J. Marion Simmons,
Mhm.
and how he basically just exploited the field of gynecology off the backs of Black slaves. And so kind of talking about these narratives and the influences that they have from past and present is something that my research touches upon. Kind of with the narratives, in what ways would these master narratives kind of impact individuals and how they view their own healthcare experience? So more so like, for example, something that is very big within my research is the way language and perception is used. So with following studies, like with implicit biases, something that is heavily reinforced is um, quick associations. So, for example, when you think of a Black person, you think immediately a criminal or something negative. And so, with those kind of implicit biases that are kind of, for some reason, are tightly held within society, how do you think this kind of influences more of the distrust within these medical institutions and just society in general?
Yes. So I will come at this from a personal experience that I have with my own family. And folks sometimes don't want, like, the dominant culture. And sometimes people who identify as Black and brown who are in leadership, or lay people, don't want to talk about this because they were like, this is so long ago. Why are you bringing this up? So the Tuskegee experiments, those experiments that were done around syphilis in Black men, um, and there being the medicines available to heal them. So they had the placebo, the folks that were receiving the placebo, and then, I don't want to get into the details. It sounds like you know it,
Yeah,
but
but 100%.
yes, and when it was discovered, like, just the shock, like Black and brown folks were shocked. White people were shocked around it, for those who cared about it. But my family was directly impacted by that. So for me, it's not, oh, that was a long time ago. Why are we talking about that? My grandfather's parents died as a result of that experimentation. And I just found out the story about 5 years ago through my uncle. I had no idea because my grandfather, he would take us to visit Alabama when we were young, and we would be visiting with his aunt and uncle, his aunt and uncle. He had two brothers, so they were three boys, and they were raised by the aunt and uncle. But I never asked him what happened to his parents. But his father was involved with the experiment and was infected and with syphilis, and then deteriorated over time because they didn't get the treatments. And his mother was infected as well. And so he had to be, him and his brothers had to be raised by their aunt and uncle. And so when I think about how close that is to me, like my grandfather raised me, my grandparents raised me, and the impact of the trauma and the ripple effect, like we call the documentary Aftershock for a reason, that there are ripples that exist years and years and years later. So this lack of trust, not only because I didn't know the story, but we talk about how trauma gets transferred. It's in the airspace, it's in the ecosystem. And so living with my grandfather, his silence, his resistance to doctors. He had diabetes. He would go and get the treatments and all of that other stuff, and he did what he needed to do. But there was still like this energy around him that now I know retrospectively is associated with the trauma of losing his two parents as a result of racism and degradation and disregard of the humanity of the folks that trusted them. The folks, I don't know if you know that they like were giving them food and just different things to cajole them into engaging. Like you're a researcher, so I'm sure you do, and I see you nodding. But it's that sort of thing, the dismissiveness around our lived experience, our our ancestors' experiences, how the Civil Rights Act, that was 1964. I was born in 1968. Nothing changes overnight. Like the poison of racism and patriarchy and colonial, it's embedded in every institution. And so it makes perfect sense for our survival, for us to stay connected. Once again, Sankofa, to go back and fetch what happened so that we can navigate the here and now and then create a different outcome for the future of our people. And so when folks are like dismissive, like, why are y'all still talking about this? I think about weathering. I think about epigenetics, the passing of trauma from one generation to another, especially if it's not addressed, it's going to keep on grow. It's like an infestation. And so we have every right to feel apprehensive, to be distrustful, all of that because of the things that we know about and don't know about regarding these systems. And I don't even know if I answered fully your question, but I just wanted to make sure I shared more context about who I am and how I am, and then also some of the dynamics with our people and why there is a level of distrust in these spaces.
Yeah, that's definitely something I 100% agree on. And if I could, like within the scopes of this research, I feel like there definitely is genetic trauma that is passed down through generations. And it's crazy to see how people, there are some people that truly believe that the past does not affect the present, which is absurd to me, but just talking about these issues and having these conversations is critical.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Um, Kind of like going down to the, well, down,
Yes.
yeah. Well, that's something that I've ho always been like very not obsessed with, but like gravitated towards is downstream effects. So kind of like domino effect.
Yeah. Yeah.
So with these, what are some of the most persistent misconceptions about Black and Indigenous birthing individuals that continue to be reinforced through medical discourse? You kind of, and mainstream media. This is something that you've previously talked about like um misconceptions about pain and like disregard of like humanity. But if you have more to say about that.
Sure. So, I think when like during COVID, it stood out for me even more because so many Black and Brown folks were dying. I lost so many folks, especially elders during that time. And one of the things that was touted as if it were true was that because we were already sick, unhealthy, broken, high risk, that somehow that justified or explained why we were dying at such a disproportionate rate. And it didn't. Like we have to be smarter than that. You know, it's just to relegate this huge experience and this huge loss of life. Some people lost generations of folk. You know, is disrespectful, and it's dishonorable, and it's like not good science, or good leadership, no matter where you sit in the space of leadership, whether it's a public health person or a doctor or a nurse or somebody who's a case manager. Like all of us are complicit in perpetuating these stories that hit the mainstream and they stick and stay. And listen, don't let it be a short 1 minute IG post about something like that goes viral, and then people believe it because we're lazy, and don't engage in the level of study that we need to, or we're so engaged in life and just trying to survive that we don't do the extra due diligence to understand and know what the truth of the matter is. So these misconceptions, these falsehoods, these lies get perpetuated. So when the belief and misconception is that our bodies as Black and Brown folks are predisposed to worse outcomes, and also that we're angry, which makes us sicker. We're uneducated, which makes us more susceptible to getting sick and not getting what we need to get done and taken care of because we're just too ignorant, or that we're too emotional. Like people would be able to serve us and we wouldn't have our lives on the line if we would just comply and if we were more passive and open to taking direction. So these lies distract from the real culprit, which is systemic and institutional racism. And once again, I talk about the siblings, quadruplets or triplets. I have tried to think of all of them: white supremacy culture, patriarchy, misogyny, which is the counterpart of patriarchy, colonialism. Like all of these pieces play capitalism. Let's not forget that. Oh my gosh. So we have to pay attention to all these interwoven parts and how they impact all of us, not just Black and Brown folk, and that anything that is being talked about to transform the outcomes for Black and Brown people is going to move upstream, across stream, downstream, for folks who identify as white. We all win when we take care of everybody equitably. So I just want to just say this last piece. When institutions silence our truths through these misconceptions and allow them to keep being perpetuated, it distances themselves, like those leaders in it, in the larger body, from accountability and integrity regarding the work. And ultimately, medical care, just like my oath as a psychotherapist, is to do no harm, to serve other and not serve self. And some of these institutions and people in them have been self-serving. And I'm complete.
Yeah, definitely love your neighbor. And like stress is a silent killer, and
Yes.
so many issues are intertwined and interconnected, and that's something that I enjoy learning about and doing research towards. So thank you for communicating all this to me. So kind of to go to the questions, how do you think policy decisions are shaped by narratives that dominate health and medical discourse? So more sorts as like, how do policies in like public health and medicine reflect and perpetuate these racialized narratives, like further influencing societal attitudes and just overall accessibility to healthcare and treatment?
Yes, thank you for this question. Oh my gosh, it's so multi-layered. So narratives, as I shared when I was talking about words, dictate where funding goes, um, which issues get prioritized, what groups get attention, what possibilities there are for transforming the low vibrational, disparate and inequitable outcomes for communities that have been historically marginalized, made invisible, racialized. Yeah, and who's considered worthy of investment is determined by the dominant culture, sadly, or people who look like the folks that need to be served, but they've been indoctrinated by the narratives and the mindset and the worldview of the dominant culture. So they perpetuate the very same things that are doing harm to their people. And it's not always conscious. There's something called internalized racial oppression that colors, and I'm using that term with intention, how we think, how we design and declare policy, what elected officials and policymakers bring to the table when they're negotiating what policies need to be put in place. So those paradigms, those biases, those blind spots definitely impact what happens and what gets explored and what gets kept and maintained and what gets knocked out, like we're looking at now with the current administration, and their posture around DEI and the false narrative that it only serves Black and Brown people, and therefore it's not equitable for those who identify as white male or other. So if maternal mortality among Black women is framed as a health disparity instead of a human rights crisis, it receives less urgency, right? It's them and what they're doing. And if they could get it together, then they would be better rather than looking at the systemic and institutional issues that impact and shift policy around those. So when policy is shaped without our voices, Black and Brown people and voices, and LGBTQIA plus folk, and all those intersecting identities are not, and when they're not included, then our lived experiences are not woven into the policymaking process, and it will often perpetuate harm instead of preventing it from happening. And then, the other part of your question, just thinking about policies that limit access to midwifery care, to doula support, or focuses on doulas and not midwifery and other levels of support. And then doulas become the panacea, which is problematic. I love doulas. I have so many doulas in my life. But if you start throwing money at doulaship and not focusing on the full landscape of reproductive health, then you're missing the point. It has to be looked at holistically. So we limit access to community birthing centers or home birth as an option and don't create the space for people to have that choice. Then it's a narrow scope and view of, birthing and reproductive health. And then the medicalization of childbirth and navigating may stay in place instead of looking at different ways to approach birth that we used, when my grandmother's grandmother and mother's grandmother were alive and folks survived, so policies that require burdensome documentation or criminalize substance use during pregnancy or disproportionately harm Black and Indigenous birthing people because of the things they believe about life and the world and their children and families, it's dangerous and problematic. So these are not just bureaucratic decisions that are being made. They're extensions of the same harmful narratives that have always controlled our reproductive lives and will continue to do harm and kill us off. And for me, bad policy creates an existential crisis. And when we are facing an existential crisis, that means we could no longer exist as a people if these policies and practices continue. And that's my concern. I want us to be around in the next 200 years as a people.
For sure. I definitely feel like diversifying research and just altering the current policies we have in place is absolutely pivotal, especially nowadays. I feel like more advocacy and just conversations like these and including them in higher education and conferences and panels and speaking out and just like reaching out to multiple people is the number one thing, I feel like. So in a sense of like these challenging these embedded biases and overall harmful behavior. In your advocacy and healing work, how do you challenge these harmful narratives and reframe the discussion around maternal health? Like, how can we disrupt the reinforcement of these racialized biases in medical language and public health messaging?
Thank you for that. There is no one way to approach it. And I know you know that. I just wanted to say it out loud. I don't know who else will be listening to this or engaging with what you're creating, which is so powerful. Um, I mentioned earlier that I approach my life, my work holistically. The ancestors are a major part of what I do, and I tap into historical things that were done that were amazing, like the Underground Railroad. I'm blown away by the fact that we have all of this technology, all these platforms to communicate. Here we are in Zoom. You and I were talking on text, via email. There's WhatsApp. There's the IG DMs, and like just all these different mechanisms for communication. And we still can't get it right. But during the Underground Railroad, during the antebellum period, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, all of the white abolitionists that supported the movement, they were able to make this amazing thing happen with very little. And also, you know, our ancestors, those who identify as Black and who were enslaved, risked life and limb for their freedom. So when I think about now, I think about the power that they wielded to stay connected to the motherland in Africa, which is storytelling. Like they kept some of the language, the connection with the drum, the spiritual practices. They found ways to weave it in and have it be hidden, but also present through the songs and quilting. So I center storytelling. I center ceremony and art. I'm an artivist. So my art is utilized to promote and perpetuate activism and revolutionary action. These are all tools for truth telling and liberation. These are also like narrative strategy and different ways to gather qualitatively and quantitatively information that will inform what we do and what we don't do is super critical. And folks are getting clearer about that, but it's a long journey because there's a lot of attachment to, you know, quantitative data being empirical data that comes from, just the numbers. And we have historically, as a people, as Black and brown people, been left out of research and not been the persons to design the research. That's why what you're doing is so, so important because you have a different worldview and you look at this work differently. We've been dominated by white men when it comes to research, and it's shifting, but it's a slow shift, but I still feel hopeful. So through my organization, the ARIA Foundation, and through my company, Spirit of a Woman, we create sacred spaces where Black and brown people can reclaim our power, share our truths, share the narrative from our perspectives, and imagine a new future. I'm heavily into Afrofuturism, which is a terminology that was amplified by Octavia Butler, the author. I don't know if you've read her, but she's amazing. And there are other Afrofuturistic leaders that buy into it. But it's like using your imagination to envision a world where Black folk, Indigenous folk are like reactivating the things of old so that we can create something new. So we don't just resist systems in the work that I do and the collectives I'm a part of. I also believe in collective impact and collective action as a theoretical framework for moving forward, decolonizing, decentralizing the work so it's not owned by anyone, because white supremacy and patriarchy speak about I own this, my research, my beliefs, my theoretical frameworks, and it's problematic. So we need to build alternatives rooted in joy, dignity, and ancestral wisdom. I believe the real AI is not artificial intelligence, it's ancestral intelligence. And reframing the narrative means returning to the truth. And our bodies are not broken, the system is broken. And so to re-envision the system is something that we absolutely must do to create new and different outcomes for a future. And also so that we can assure that we have a future as a people. Because when I talked about the existential crisis, it's not just for Black and brown folk, it's for white folk as well.
Yeah, that's really powerful. So you kind of within the this question, you kind of answered my next question, but I'm just gonna ask it anyways because I feel like very relevant. So, what role do community-driven narratives and ancestral knowledge play in reclaiming and reshaping agency over maternal health? You kind of
Yeah.
touched on this before, but like just to reiterate.
Sure, thank you. So I think they're everything, right? As I said, our ancestors knew how to birth. They trusted the body. That's the other thing that's so appalling is that you strap them. No, this is extreme. I was going to say strap down, but in the carceral system, you can be handcuffed to a bed while you birth. But we hook people up to machines while they're birthing, or preparing to give birth. We tell them to keep still. We tell them that they can't eat, and move around, get on their feet unless we dictate it and when it's supposed to happen. We declare that if it's taking too long, air quotes again, that we need to boost it by giving medications to move everything faster and do something unnatural with the body. If the bed is not being open quick enough, we operate from a space of we got to move this along because we got to make this money. So the medicalization of birthing and the commodification of birthing is problematic, and it's creating some of the outcomes. If I'm tense, if I'm scared, if all these systems are going off, the heartbeat over here and the tracings of the babies, like it's very, very anxiety provoking. And our ancestors knew that we needed peace and calm. We need to call the baby in. We need to do certain things with the woman in her body or the birthing person in their bodies to help them relax enough to do this sacred work, which is to bring new life into the world. In historical times, if the baby was breech or there were multiple babies, twins or triplets or quadruplets, they didn't automatically go into you need a C-section. They would come up with a plan, and trust the earth, the herbs that are in the earth to help move the process along and move the babies through safely. It's problematic. So, and also community and collective support rather than this individualized, my family, my birth, my process, like returning to family and community, and collective driven narratives and outcomes to remind us that we are not alone, that we come from strength and legacy, and that we can do more together than we can ever do apart. So there's an African-centered concept that, once again, I embrace as part of my work, and it's called Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is I am because we are, not this individualized, I got this, and I'm pulling myself up by my own bootstraps. That's a fallacy. So when we uplift these voices, when we create models of care that are culturally rooted, trauma informed, and truly life affirming, then beautiful things happen, and we can keep perpetuating life and have it be balanced and generative rather than limited and exhausting. Because living can be exhausting when you have these systems of oppression in place.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I feel like definitely, even when a woman gives birth, they say it takes a community, it takes a village.
Ashe.
It definitely takes a village in order for us to dismantle these current systems that are in place. So, kind of just bouncing off to the next question,
Sure.
can medical professionals and healthcare public leaders become more intentional in addressing the linguistic and cultural biases that are embedded in healthcare communication?
Yeah, it's super important for institutions to engage in study. And I don't mean a one-off performative, perfunctory workshop. It's like, oh, check the box. Everybody went to implicit bias training. It has to be embedded into all of the meetings that you have in public health spaces and in institutions that provide care, clinics. Like it has to be a part of the culture and the ecosystem of the organizations and institutions. The language needs to be intentional. Like in this conversation, I keep saying mothers and birthing people because not everybody who has a womb identifies as a woman. Not everybody who gives birth identifies as a woman or a mama. And there's this backlash about saying that. But the science of it is it's true, right? We can be born and it can look black and white, like male or female, but that's not necessarily true. So all this resistance, we need to work through because I have heterosexual privilege, and the normative in this society is of a heterosexual mindset and view and lens, and that's not fair or balanced. So we need to be looking at, that's just one example, but looking at how we speak, how we write, how some of the things that we did when we learned and went through school 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, depending on who the person is, no longer applies for the life and the culture that we are a part of now. Professionals need to listen and also recognize that they listen through filters that perpetuate bias and one-dimensional thinking, not just rely on data, but the people or the human data, right? The conversations, the connections, the alignment. And of course, there need to be boundaries. But when I work with people, I want to connect to their humanity. And the way to do that is sometimes to disclose things about myself or to be open to share something. Like we've been taught to be a blank slate, but we're really not. You know, objectivity, as I said earlier, doesn't exist. We live in a very subjective world and we are meaning making machines. So, as clinicians, as professionals, as leaders in public health, we just need to make sure that we're accountable, that we have cultural humility, not just information and consciousness, but humility. It's like, I don't know what I don't know, and that we need to invest in policy change if we have the power and the wherewithal to make that happen. And as much as possible, tap in and make sure that they're operating from inclusivity, talking to the folks that they serve, doing surveys, asking, doing informal question asking so they can get to whether people feel comfortable and safe in my individual presence as a clinician or in the overall presence or ecosystem at the clinic, hospital, space where the services are being provided. And then doing language audits, creating inclusive frameworks and co-designing communication strategies, once again, with the community so that they have a say in how that works and what lands for them as clear and aligned with how they navigate and use language. But most importantly, I think these leaders need to relinquish the idea that they are the only experts in the room, that I'm an expert when I show up in the space to get medical care. And our expertise combined together can do great things if we just allow it.
Yeah, 100%. To kind of give you more information about me, I'm not only a researcher, but I hopefully one day intend to become a provider, a
Oh,
future
yes.
doctor. And I definitely have that framework of one size does not fit all. And definitely inclusivity, diversifying research is critical. Yeah. So with all of this and the research that I do, I am hopeful for a more inclusive and more equitable future. But just for as closing questions,
Sure.
what gives you hope in the fight for birth equity and narrative justice? Like, what strategies have you found effective in shifting societal attitudes and just overall fostering more equitable perspectives on maternal health and racial justice?
Sure. So I'll go back to the concept of Sankofa. Because I engage in the way out is back through, go back and fetch the information from the past, I see clearly. And of course, my looking back is not exhaustive. Like there's always more to look at and discover. I discover new people and stories every day. But that Sankofa energy keeps me hopeful, keeps me aligned, allows me to see how resilient and power we are, not the low vibrational resilience, like we keep getting pummeled and we keep rising again. I think that is problematic. But just thinking about how innovative and creative we are, once again, going back to the Underground Railroad, also think about the Green Book, the Negro's Traveler's Guide, that a postal worker, a Black postal worker created because he recognized that when he would travel on the Eastern Corridor from the North to the South, that there were sundown states and, sometimes he would be chased by the police or stopped and harassed. He would be, victimized. And he was just like, we need a safe spaces where we can go and get gas when we're traveling from New York to Alabama, like I did when I was a kid. We need places where we can eat and lay our heads and rest from travel. We need spaces that we know this is a sundown state, so we can't be caught after sundown in this space. So because of technologies, sacred technologies like that, we can go back and replicate. Sometimes we try to reinvent the wheel that already exists. And we just need to go back and fetch what has been done and make it aligned with these modern times. So, we just keep rising and organizing and creating beauty and facing injustice collectively. And some of this stuff needs to be shifted because we've been impacted by internalized racial oppression, which impacts how we think and how we trust our ancestral connection and our lineage. But I know that's shifting. I watch it every day. So I see hope in the voices of young leaders that I get to work with. I work with people in their 20s and their 30s, and I'm 56. It's amazing to watch. You are one of those folk. I see hope in the art that we're making and in the healing that we share. Strategies that work are the ones that center lived experience and elevate collective power and build bridges. And also, just what I'm about to do for April with others is generate the reproductive freedom train using AI and immersive experience, and merging the past, present, and the future, and bringing them together for this sacred vision and sacred dramatization. So I'm excited about that, but I'm not doing anything new. I'm just doing it for these times. That's how I view it.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm definitely RSVP to that
Yay!
April 4th and April 5th events. But yeah, kind of this was the last question, but
Sure.
um if you could see one fundamental shift in how we frame discussions around maternal health and racial inequalities, what would it be?
Mm, let me think about this. I would shift the framework from a space of thought set, I'm making up a word, and mindset of from deficit to like dignity.
Mhm.
Um, we are taught to see things from what's wrong. And I love this because it comes from the ACEs training, the adverse childhood experiences. So instead of asking someone what's wrong with you, ask them what happened to you. And
Mhm.
then the person can share what happened to them. And then from there, you can start to build. But if you come from a space of this person is broken, they're wrong, that shift needs to happen, and a shift in narrative as this vast well that's multidimensional and not just one-sided or like one way of thinking, but just looking at it from all these different perspectives. I also would invite in, because I talked about patriarchy so much earlier, feminine perspective. And I'm not talking about gender, I'm talking about energy and vibration,
Mhm.
feminine concepts, intuition, deep feeling, expressiveness, emotive ways of being, because telling us that we need to not feel as we lead doesn't work. It's a false paradigm that's killing us, and that has us waging wars when there ought not be any, and thinking from a space of dominance when it's really an opportunity to co-create. So, and just stop focusing solely on our pain and statistics, and instead center our brilliance, solutions, and our right to thrive as a people. We're not problems to be solved. We are people to be honored, in all of the facets of life, including nature, have to be included in this process so that we can all live another day.
Mhm. That's beautiful. Like mind, body, and soul, I definitely agree with like integrating everything in a sense of like more holistic view. As I am, I don't know if I mentioned this in the email, but I am Latinx and I'm also indigenous as well. So
Oh, awesome.
yeah, so I definitely agree with like everything that you were saying, and like I feel like representation is critical.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I'm so grateful that you have had the opportunity to interview you. I was definitely inspired by the film Aftershock, and that is also one of the pivotal like moments that kind of influenced me in this writing, my research, and just overall perceptions and how that can kind of lead to more downstream, affecting downstream attitudes.
Sure.
Thank you so much. I
Sure.
really appreciate your
I mean,
all of your guidance and all of your input and all of your invaluable knowledge. Thank you so much. And yeah, of
Abigail. Yes, have a great day. And if you need anything else, just reach out, please.
course, thank you so much. And I hope to see you in the April 4th. Um,
April 4th? What's happening April 4th? Just remind me.
isn't that the event for
The Freedom Train?
Yeah.
It's at the end of the month. It's April 25th and 26th. But you know, if you registered, you'll get the notification. I was like, wait a minute, what am I missing on April 4th? Because I'm like, it could be possible.
Oh,
I'm
I was like, wait,
no,
okay.
no, lots of dates and times in the head, but it's the end of the month. I'm like, thank God, because we need more time to build all of this out. But it's the Friday 6 to 9 and the Saturday, the 26th from 1 to 4 on Zoom and YouTube. So, but if you registered, you'll get the notifications and the reminders. So I look forward to being with you on that day too, on
Mhm.
those days. All right,
Yeah,
take care.
thank you too.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, Professor. That went very beautifully. Let's see. I'm not sure if you're still on, but I think the end of the recording. I'm not sure if I can end it. Let me see. Professor Johnson, are you there? I'm gonna call you.